Good afternoon, and welcome to the UNH-IOL's informational webinar on NVMe testing and the benefits of joining the UNH-IOL Testing Consortium. I'll be turning the presentation over to David Woolf, Senior Technical Manager at the UNH-IOL NVMe and PCIe Consortium. David.
All right, thank you, Susie. So like Susie said, we're going to talk a little bit today about the NVMe Plugfest and what's going to happen there, and some tips for those of you that are participating. At the end, we're going to have a Q&A session. So I'd encourage, if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to enter those in the chat, and we'll handle them that way. I'm just going to start with a little bit of an introduction about the lab itself, just for those of you that aren't familiar with UNH-IOL, and a little bit of an explanation of why we're involved in the NVMe Plugfest. UNH-IOL, we are the University of New Hampshire Interoperability Lab. We're a third-party test facility. We deal in a lot of different areas of data communications, wide area networks, local area networks, storage, mobile devices, and 100% funded by commercial industry. So even though we have our home at a university, we're completely funded by the industries that we serve. We're about an hour north of Boston, and we've done, I don't know how many hundreds of Plugfests and Interop events over our 25-year history. Some of the companies that we are working with, you may see your own company there. And then a little bit about our direct involvement with NVMe and what we're providing there. We do provide test services. We're coordinating the Plugfests in conjunction with the NVMe Promoters Group. We have some test software, which I'm going to provide some more detail on in the presentation today. And these are used for doing the conformance testing for the NVMe Integrators list. We host the NVMe Integrators list, which is public now. You can go and see which devices have qualified for that. And part of working with us is that you can include a product, if it qualifies, on that list, but also include products in our interoperability test bed. That makes it available for interop testing with other NVMe products. You can get reporting from that. And then also another thing that we're handling is support for the TIA NVMe tool. You may be familiar with that. It's an open source tool available on GitHub. And we're also doing PCIe testing. That's something a lot of NVMe customers are interested in. So that's just a quick overview of the lab and a very brief history of our involvement in NVMe. But really our primary purpose in this webinar today is to talk about the NVMe Plugfest. The dates for that you see here, February 24th through 27th at our headquarters in Durham, New Hampshire, USA. So a little bit more detail about what we're going to talk about. Some about the NVMe program, NVMe test program, the goals of that, a little bit about how it works and our collaboration with the NVMe Promoters Group. And then we're going to dig into the Plugfest itself and things specifically that you can do to prepare for the Plugfest. And even if you're not going to be able to attend the Plugfest, things that you can do to prepare for NVMe testing if you're interested in having a product listed on the Integrators list. After that, we're going to move into the logistics of the Plugfest, how to register, where to register, and then a walkthrough of the different test stations that we're going to have set up at the Plugfest so you can get a good idea of exactly what we're going to be doing. A quick look at the test reports that we'll be producing coming out of the event. A little bit of information about the process for listing products, how that's done, what kind of information is necessary in order to list a product. And then finally, some information, again, for those folks who perhaps aren't going to be ready for the Plugfest or maybe are going to have products coming out after the Plugfest, some information about how you can still have products tested and get them included in the NVMe Integrators list. So that's just an overview of a little more of the details about what we're going to talk about today. Again, you know, one of the reasons this is so pertinent is the growth that we're seeing in SSD shipments And of course, with NVMe as a very compelling solution for both client and enterprise storage, we're seeing a lot of growth in those markets. And so there's really a need as a community and as an industry for NVMe to demonstrate its interoperability and compliance. And so the Plugfest that we're coordinating is a really big part of that. So let's move into some of the details of exactly how UNH-IOL and the NVMe Promoters Group are working together. We've actually been working together for a little over a year and a half now, the NVMe Promoters Group and UNH-IOL, and we've been building a test program that's really focused on a public integrators list. So UNH-IOL is the management for that event, or for that list. And here's just a quick screenshot of the list itself. Again, as I mentioned before, it's hosted directly on the UNH-IOL website. Here's the link for it. And after the Plugfest, we'll be adding more products to this list. So you might think of this integrators list that is hosted by UNH-IOL and promoted by the NVMe Promoters Group. Think of it as kind of an industry resource for listing products that have been tested. They've been proven to be interoperable with various operating systems, various different NVMe drivers, and proven to be conformant to the NVMe specification. And the test plans that we use at the Plugfest, they're industry accepted. They've been reviewed by many companies. They've been reviewed by the NVMe Promoters Group. So having a product on the NVMe integrators list is really a sign of interoperability and conformance. A little bit about the goals of this. Why did we choose to do an integrators list? Why are we choosing to do Plugfest? What's the purpose of all of this? Again, it's to prove the robustness and the interoperability of these products. Anytime that we're dealing with a new technology, a new standard, there's bound to be hiccups and bumps in the road. And so this test program is aimed at smoothing those out and really helping implementers, helping companies that are adopting this technology, that are building and designing these products, to have a vehicle for ensuring that they're conformant and that they're going to be interoperable when their products make it out into the field. And also the list itself provides a means of recognizing products that have met those qualifications, and that's backed up by the testing that's done not only at the Plugfest, but also outside of the Plugfest at UNH-IOL. So how do we determine what the qualifications are for the integrators list? Well, that is something that's publicly listed, again, on the UNH-IOL site. If you go to the integrators list page, you'll also find a link to the policy document that describes in detail what products need to do and what the process is for getting a product on the list. But that's not something that UNH-IOL just came up with on our own. We've worked closely with the NVMe Promoters Group, not only in defining the policy for the integrators list, but also in defining the tests that are going to be performed to determine if a device is qualified. Now, the Plugfest is special because this is when we debut our new test requirements. So if you've been following NVMe, you might be aware that our first NVMe Plugfest was actually in May of 2013, so almost a year ago. Now we're going to be introducing some new test requirements. You're probably aware that the NVMe spec itself has been revved to version 1.1. And so to coincide with that, we're also revving our test program in parallel with the updates to the NVMe specification. So we've got a couple new requirements, and the list is going to reflect that some products were listed according to the 1.0 program, but some products are going to be listed to this new program, 1.1. And the Plugfest is really where we're going to kick it off. That's the first opportunity for products to be tested to and posted to the integrators list according to these new 1.1 test requirements. Now again, even if products aren't quite ready for the Plugfest, or perhaps companies have multiple products and they can't get them all tested at the Plugfest, that 1.1 testing for the integrators list is going to continue throughout the year at UNH-IOL. So while the Plugfest is the first opportunity to do that testing, it's certainly not the last. And that additional testing is something that UNH-IOL members can request after the Plugfest. Schedule time at the lab, send their products in and have that 1.1 testing performed, and then subsequently have a product listed on the Integrators list. So now I'd like to dig a little bit more into the components of the Plugfest itself, and we're going to focus on two things, the test plans and the test tools. And these are some things that it's very valuable to be familiar with in order to properly prepare for the Plugfest, but also for any kind of Integrators list testing that you might want to have done. So there's really two test plans that we're going to be performing at the Plugfest. One is an interoperability test plan, and one is a conformance test plan. Now, the Interop test plan, it's a fairly straightforward interoperability test. Essentially, we'll take an SSD, install it into a host system. That system could be simply a motherboard, it could be a server, could be a desktop PC. And we're going to make sure that that SSD can be properly identified in the operating system, that a format can occur, and we have a utility where we're going to do some write, read, and verify tests, and then a series of reboots and shutdowns to make sure that there's no problems that occur during restart or anything like that. That's a really quick overview of the interoperability test plans. You'll see at the bottom here I have a link to our test suites page. If you go there and download the 1.1 interoperability test plan, you can see some more of the details of that. So those are the tests that are really required. We also have what we're calling FYI tests, or optional experimental tests. These tests aren't required for the Integrators list, but as I said, every so often we're going to be, revving the requirements, kind of raising the bar of quality that we're expecting from these products. And so we do some of these experimental tests to collect information on how we can put those test procedures together, what's reasonable, what's not reasonable. So the two FYI tests that we're going to be doing at this Plugfest, we're going to be doing a UEFI boot test, where we actually try and install an operating system onto the NVMe device and then boot from it. We're doing some experiments with that right now at the lab, and we're going to continue doing that at the Plugfest. So that's an opportunity for all of us to kind of collect some information about how this works and what's the best way to do the test. Also, we're going to be doing a hot plug test. So, of course, when we think about NVMe, a very common form factor there is going to be the 2.5-inch disk drive. SAS handles hot plug, SATA handles hot plug. PCIe handles hot plug as well, but since it's a new form factor and a lot more people are going to be using that hot plug functionality when putting an NVMe device in that 2.5-inch drive form factor, we want to make sure we have a test to address that. So again, that's an experimental test. It's an FYI test only, not required today for Integrators list qualification. So we're expecting a number of different SSD products at the event. The UNH-IOL is going to have a whole series of NVMe hosts set up, and I'm going to get into the details of which hosts those are going to be later. But we're going to try and run all the SSDs that we have at the event against all the different hosts. So you can imagine that's going to be a pretty big matrix of tests, quite a number of interop tests happening, but it's a great way of proving the reliability and interoperability of these products. In addition to the Interop test plan, we're going to be performing a conformance test plan. Now in this case, instead of actually using a pure NVMe host system, we're going to be using a host emulator, a test tool, to exercise and simulate the SSD and do a series of admin commands, NVM commands. We're going to be reading and writing some of the controller registers. And all of that is generated by the test tools. So those I mentioned earlier, the IOL INTERACT test tools. I'll get into a little bit more detail about where you can get those and how to use them a little further on in the presentation. But the test plan itself, again, here's the link for that. If you go to this, you'll see a link for the 1.1 Conformance Test Suite. You can review that and see exactly what kind of things we're going to be testing in detail and see the algorithms for that. So after you've reviewed the test plans and done that step for preparation, the next thing to do is use some of the test tools that we're going to be using at the event. 3 primary test tools that we're going to be using: the IOL INTERACT PC edition, the IOL INTERACT Teledyne LaCroix edition, and then finally VD Bench. So the first two tools here are used for the conformance testing, and the last one is used for the interop testing. So we'll address each of these in a little more detail. First, the IOL INTERACT PC edition. This is a NVMe test tool. It's available through UNH-IOL. It runs on Ubuntu 12.04. If you'd used this tool in the past, you may have been familiar that it ran on Ubuntu 10.10. We've made some updates so that it can use a more modern version of Ubuntu. Currently runs on Ubuntu 12.04. And essentially what this tool is, you might think of it as a wrapper for the TNVMe open source tool that executes all of the tests that you need for the conformance portion of qualification for the NVMe Integrators list. So it does that very quickly and very easily. I've got a link here to a presentation that was given at the 2013 Flash Memory Summit. It's actually a walkthrough on the installation and use of the IOL INTERACT tool. So this is a nice kind of preparation for you to understand exactly how to use that tool and how to install it. But this is the tool that we're going to be using to perform the conformance testing at the Plugfest in February. It's available through UNH-IOL. If you're a UNH-IOL member, you can get this software, download it, and then run it on any PC you have in your lab and get an idea before you come to the event about how your device measures up according to these tests. The other tool is the IOL INTERACT Teledyne LaCroix edition. Now, whereas the PC edition just required a PC with Ubuntu 12.04 on it, this version of the software is actually an automation suite. It performs all of the same tests, but it does it with the LaCroix Summit Z3 PCIe tool. Many of you are probably familiar with that. The advantage here is that when you use this tool, you get a detailed PCIe bus trace of exactly what happened on the bus. So from an NVMe perspective, we're trying to use these tools to execute the same test. But obviously when you're using the Teledyne LaCroix bus analyzer, you're going to get a lot more detailed information from those bus traces. We're in the process right now of updating this tool to use the LaCroix software build 6.75. But that's the one that, if you're using this tool, it's very likely that you're using software build 675. So we're in the process of doing some updates to make sure that our automation package works well with that. And this is really the one that we're going to use for the final determination of qualification for the Integrators list, because with this tool, we actually have the ability to dig down and actually look at the bus trace and see exactly what happened on the bus. So again, both of those tools are doing the same tests, but with different capabilities and different strengths. Certainly the ability to look at the bus traces with the LaCroix tool is quite valuable. And that's an automation test suite that if you have a LaCroix Summit Z3 tool, obviously that's necessary for doing this. The automation suite that performs the NVMe Integrators list test also available through the UNH-IOL membership. The last tool is VDBench. You're probably familiar with this utility. It's a simple storage utility. It's available publicly available, both on SourceForge and also directly from Oracle. And essentially, it's just a command line utility for generating I/O workloads to disk. We chose this because since it's a Java program, it allows us to perform the same tests on Windows, on Linux, on Solaris, and do that very easily. We've created a parameter file for VDBench. Again, it's available on the UNH-IOL website. Here's the link for it here. So you can go to the website, you can download this parameter file, set up an NVMe drive in your system, and you can emulate all of the interop tests that we're going to do at the Plugfest. So you can get a feel for how those work. So if you have this parameter file, you have VDBench, and you have the test plan that we referred to before, you can actually walk through and get a good understanding for exactly the procedure that we're going to be doing for the interoperability tests. Of course, the advantage of being at the Plugfest is there's going to be a number of systems set up for you to use, some of which are set up by UNH-IOL, some of which are going to be brought by attending host companies. So there's going to be a wide variety of systems to do interop testing against. But this is the utility that we'll be using to do that interoperability testing. So that gives you an idea of the things you can do to prepare for the event and prepare for NVMe Integrators list testing. We'll go through now and talk a little bit about the logistics of the event, what's necessary for registration, a walkthrough of the test stations that we're going to have set up, and then a little bit about the test reports we're going to produce. So registration, we have our registration page up and live on the UNH-IOL website. A number of companies have already registered for the event. Here's the link here and a quick screenshot of what you can expect to see when you go there. The registration is pretty straightforward, just looking for typical contact information, a little bit of information about the type of product that you're going to be bringing to the event. That shouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes to fill out. Do pay attention, though, that the registration is open to UNH-IOL members. I'll get a little bit into the test stations. As I mentioned before, we're going to have a number of SSDs present at the event and a number of host stations set up. And we're going to cycle all of the SSDs through all of the host stations for Interop and all the test stations for Conformance. As I mentioned, the Conformance ones, the Conformance stations are test tools. Some of them are FYI. They're just experimental things to help us learn how to do the testing. They're not necessary today for the Integrators list qualifications. So coming up, I've got a little map of the test event. We've got some color coding to it. You're going to see the green items are the Conformance stations, and the lighter green are the Conformance stations that are not required. Got a little bit of a typo here. The blue stations are the Interop stations that are required, and then the light blue ones are the FYI stations. So essentially, when products come to the event, we're going to be moving them through all of the different test stations. I can't promise that we'll follow the exact order that's being illustrated here, but all of the Conformance stations, you'll see up in the corner there the IOL INTERACT PC edition, as well as the IOL INTERACT Teledyne LaCroix edition. We'll do both of those Conformance test stations. Then we'll have a couple other NVMe Conformance test stations from other test companies that want to make sure that their Conformance plans actually match what's necessary for the NVMe Integrators list, and helping them correlate their test results to what we've already done with IOL INTERACT. We're also going to have a PCIe PHY Conformance test station. Again, that's an FYI. It's not required for Integrators list testing. But we do think that as people are implementing PCIe or implementing NVMe, perhaps with new PCIe cores, perhaps in a new form factor, that electrical data could be very interesting for them. So that's going to be available at the NVMe Plugfest as well. As I mentioned, we have the hot plug test station, the UEFI boot test station, and then a number of hosts that are going to be set up. Now here I've got 7 different hosts shown, several Windows products and then several Linux products. In addition to these, there's going to be products that are brought by attending companies. So as I mentioned before, one of those test stations is the IOL INTERACT PC edition. Again, if you'd like to have that set up and experiment with that prior to the event, certainly contact UNH-IOL. Same with the IOL INTERACT Teledyne LaCroix edition. If you happen to have the hardware for being able to run that, you can get your hands on that prior to the event and have a good idea of how your product is going to perform in those Conformance tests. Some of the FYI tests, a couple other test companies are coming, looking to correlate their test solutions with existing ones. And keep in mind that these are FYI only, not required for the Integrators list. Same with the PCIe PHY test, FYI only, just to help people with their implementation, again, not required for the Integrators list. 2 Interop test stations, we've got the hot plug and the UEFI, again, not required for Integrators list qualification. And then the 7 systems that are required for the IL qualification. So here you'll see that we've got Windows Server 2012, and Windows 7. Both of those are going to be using the OFA reference driver. That's one that you can download from the OFA website. And then also Windows Server 2012 R2 and Windows 8.1. Those two are special because rather than the OFA reference driver, they're going to be using the native Microsoft NVMe driver. So those are the Windows systems that we'll have available for Interop testing. The Linux systems that we'll have set up, Red Hat Linux 6.5, FreeBSD 9.2, and Ubuntu 12.04. Now, the NVMe IOL qualification policy requires that a device that's going to be listed is tested, speaking about an SSD right now, a device that's going to be tested, it's tested with at least 5 hosts and passes with 4 of those hosts. And of those hosts that it passes with, one of them must have a Windows operating system with either the OFA reference driver or the native Microsoft driver. And then one of them must be one of the Linux hosts with the native Linux NVMe driver. Beyond that, a product could be tested with a proprietary driver, whether it be Windows, Linux, or some other operating system. But in order to qualify for the integrators list, we're looking for at least one of those Windows drivers to pass and at least one of those native Linux drivers to pass. So be aware of those qualifications. All of the data that we collect at the event is going to be collected by UNH-IOL staff on the conformance side. We're going to be collecting the trace logs and bus traces from all of the conformance tests that we perform. And then we're also going to be collecting the Interop data. So when we run VD Bench, there's a summary and error log that's produced. UNH-IOL is going to be collecting those as well. And all of that data is going to go into producing reports, both conformance and interoperability reports that we're going to provide to all the companies that attend the event for their products that they have tested. Now, one of the requirements for having a product listed on the NVMe Integrators list is that this test report exists. This is really the evidence. This is the record that that product has qualified. So that's why collecting that data is going to be so important. Now, this report, and you see a sample of it here, these, like I said, are necessary for listing a product on the Integrators list, but we view this as something that can be shared with your partners and with your customers to help you demonstrate interoperability and conformance. So this is the product that comes out of the event. So this is the end product that these Plugfests are designed to create, these test reports to help you qualify for the NVMe Integrators list. A few more details on listing products and the process for doing that. Here I've got the link for the Integrators list policy, all the details, all the fine print, if you will. So you can go there, download that. It's open to the public to see what those requirements are. But as I mentioned, some of the very important requirements, there must be a test report from UNH-IOL in order to list a product on the Integrators list. And that report is going to indicate whether a device passed or not, whether it meets the necessary requirements. Now, just because a product passes doesn't mean we're going to automatically list it on the Integrators list. We want to receive a specific request from the company. Once IOL has provided the report, the company needs to make a specific request to have a particular product listed. We're not going to automatically be listing products. Some of the information that is actually going to be included on the Integrators list, obviously the product name, the company, the manufacturing company, the model name. In the case of an SSD family, you may include the family name. The type of product, and we've got a couple different product types. It could be an NVMe SSD. It could be an SSD controller. It could be SSD controller IP. It could be a server on the host side, a server board, a motherboard, an add-in card, a RAID controller, or IP device. Those are the accepted product types today. If the product is an NVMe host, we're going to list the operating system and driver that was used for doing the interoperability testing. If it's a device, we're going to list the firmware version. We're also going to list the Interop program revision. So if you went to the Integrators list today, you would see that the products there are listed under 1.0. After this Plugfest, new products will be listed under 1.1. In the future, we'll have a 1.2 revision, perhaps a year from now or more, and you'll see products listed under the 1.2 program. That's, of course, in the future. We'll include the date of listing, the test ID, and then also we provide a space for further information. Now, usually what we're looking for there is a primary contact on the product or perhaps a product website. So you can provide a link there. And all of that information will go into the listing on the NVMe Integrators list. Now, of course, one question that often comes up is if I have multiple products that have very slight differences that don't affect NVMe operation, do I have to have them all tested? The answer is no. We can have products that are listed by similarity. A very common case here is we have a family of SSDs, and they're all different sizes, but the controller is the same, and other than the size, the firmware is the same. And so in this case, a company can make a request to have products listed by similarity if there's no substantive changes to the product that affect the NVMe interface. So last thing we're going to talk about is testing that occurs after the Plugfest, perhaps for companies that aren't quite ready for the Plugfest, maybe their schedule isn't perfectly lining up with that, or if you are going to attend the Plugfest, but then you're going to have other products being released later in the year. What do we do in that situation? Well, as I mentioned earlier, this Plugfest that we're having next month is the first opportunity to have products tested to and listed on the new 1.1 NVMe Integrators list. However, not the last opportunity to have that done. Testing is going to continue at UNH-IOL throughout the year, and you'll be able to continually add products to that list as they become available. We're going to be maintaining our conformance test tools and our interoperability test bed for the purpose of that continuous testing. So even if you're testing a few months after the Plugfest, the test reports that you get, the conformance reports, will be very similar to what was actually performed at the Plugfest. So the Plugfest is really a nice advantage for companies that are early adopters, first movers, but certainly we want to highlight the fact that that testing is going to continue throughout the year, and that can be requested through our UNH-IOL website. So again, just reviewing the benefits of the consortium that the NVMe Promoters Group has started here at UNH-IOL. It's test services that are available to UNH-IOL members for companies that are adopting and implementing NVMe. Includes attendance at the NVMe Plugfest, access to the test tools. So we don't want people to be surprised by what we're testing at the Plugfest. We think it's really important for them to be able to try out these tools ahead of time in their own lab. So both those IOL INTERACT PC edition and the Teledyne LaCroix edition software, that's available to UNH-IOL members to help people prepare before coming to the Plugfest. Obviously, after the Plugfest, you have the option of listing a product on the Integrators list, and you can choose to have a product included in our interoperability test bed so that its testing is not limited to just the Plugfest itself or to an individual testing that's scheduled later. It can actually continuously have interoperability testing done on it throughout the year if it's present in our interoperability test bed. So again, just a quick review of our presentation today. We've talked about the Integrators list and how UNH-IOL and the NVMe Promoters Group have worked together to create a test program focused on that and to help showcase and provide recognition to interoperable and conformant products. The test tools and the test plans are available through UNH-IOL. This Plugfest is the first opportunity to have tests performed according to these new requirements, but not the last. We reviewed the various test stations that we're going to have set up and how we're going to walk the different SSDs through all of those test stations. And of course, testing will continue after the Plugfest. So thank you for your attention. I'm sure there's been some questions that you've entered in through the chat. So we'll take a few minutes now and try and answer some of those. Susie, if you've been able to collect some questions, we can answer them now.
Yes, we have a dozen or so questions here, and please feel free to continue to enter them. Before we get started on that, I just want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll post it to the website on the NVMe page, and we will also send out a link for that after the webinar is complete. So the first question that I'd ask you to address would be, is the software ready to work with Ubuntu 12.04 kernel? Or do we need to make any manual changes to the kernel?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do have it working with 12.04. There shouldn't be any changes necessary. That was a release that we did shortly before the holidays, towards the end of December. So if you haven't gotten an update, if you are a UNH-IOL member and you haven't gotten an update since then, certainly contact us and we can provide that for you. But yeah, there should be no changes that are necessary for 12.04.
Okay, great. Next question is, how do I access the interoperability suite and VD-bench parameter file that we use?
Okay, sure. So both of those are publicly available on the UNH-IOL site. They're not behind any kind of password wall or anything like that. So if you go to our test suites page, there's a link provided earlier in our presentation. I'll try and jump to that really quick. So here's the link for the parameter file. And I'm sure we'll be making these slides available after the link for the parameter file for VD-bench. And then a little bit earlier on, here at the bottom is the test suites page, and that's where you can actually find the Interop test plan itself. So both of those are available publicly on our website.
Okay, great. The next question you may have addressed regarding the LaCroix platform version. Is this ready yet, or are we still working on debugging some issues with that?
Yeah, good question. So folks have been aware that the newest version of the LaCroix platform is 6.75. We're still working on getting our automation suite to work with 6.75. We're actually working side by side with LaCroix this week on finishing the bugs there. We're hoping to have that available very soon. In the meantime, we do actually have available the version of the LaCroix software that does work with our software. So if you're interested in having that in the meantime, go ahead and contact us directly, but we'll have the update for 6.75 very soon.
Okay, next question is, our team found out from the documentation that even though 12.04 Ubuntu is supported, we had to install 2.6.35-22 server as per documentation. Can you explain the kernel version?
That one I'd probably want to defer to our lead software engineer on that, so I'm not prepared to answer that question. Perhaps that's one we can answer offline.
Okay, great. Next question is, must I be a UNH-IOL member to attend the Plugfest event?
Yeah, that's a pretty common question, and the answer is yes. It is open to UNH-IOL members only. Of course, it's important to note that the Plugfest is not the only benefit of being a UNH-IOL member. And really the view from the NVMe Promoters Group is that this is a comprehensive solution for NVMe testing that we're offering. So yes, there is the Plugfest, but there's also the test tools that are available. There's also the access to the Interop test bed. There's the access to test services. So while a membership is necessary to attend the Plugfest, that is not the only benefit of membership at UNH-IOL. There's quite a few others.
Okay, next question. Are all of the NVMe compliance test cases exercised by IOL INTERACT PC edition? If not,
yeah, that's a good question. Oh, does that continue?
Yes, sorry. If not,
okay.
which NVMe test cases are exercised by IOL INTERACT PC edition?
Okay, sure thing. So to answer the first part, no, not all of the NVMe test cases are exercised by IOL INTERACT. The IOL INTERACT just exercises the test cases that are necessary for performing the conformance tests that have been defined by UNH-IOL and the NVMe promoters group. The second question is a little bit more complicated about which test cases are actually executed by IOL INTERACT. And so again, for that, I'd probably want to answer that offline because we'd actually be stepping through each of the NVMe test cases. So again, I would defer to my lead engineer on that, but that's some information that we can provide in the future. But it is a subset of all of the test cases that are contained within NVMe.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, when will LaCroix conformance scripts for 6.75 version be available?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we've been working on that this week. We're hoping to have something available by February 1st. That's kind of the deadline that we're targeting.
Okay, let's see. The NVMe's test plan has 269 test cases listed. The UNH-IOL NVMe Test Consortium test plan for NVMe Conformance version 1.1 lists 41 test cases.
Oh, we're just looking for an explanation on that? Sure. Yeah, the NVMe test suite is quite comprehensive and quite exhaustive. And when we reviewed this with the promoters group, we wanted to make sure that the integrators list focused on the items that were the most important in order to prove conformance. And so that's why you'll see a smaller number of test cases in the UNH-IOL test plan versus the NVMe, the number of cases that are in NVMe. Another thing to be aware of is that some of the IOL test cases actually use or implement several of the NVMe test cases. They don't all just implement one. So there's kind of two things at work there. Some of the UNH test cases perform more than one NVMe test case. And then purposefully, we chose it to be a subset of all of the NVMe test cases, the ones that we felt were the most important, the most essential for proving conformance.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, if it is plug and play with 12.04, why does the documentation say that we need to install a specific kernel version on top of the 12.04 Ubuntu?
Okay. Yeah, again, I would probably defer that to the lead software engineer. That may be a fix in the documentation that's necessary.
Okay, I think there might be a lot of questions, Dave, that might, or people are requesting specific calls with us. So why don't we put it out there that if there is more information needed or the lead engineer needs to join us, that anyone can schedule a call with Carrie Munson here at the IOL, and her email is Carrie Munson, MUNSON @iol.unh.edu, and we'd be happy to set up conference calls to help support those questions in more detail at another time.
Sure.
We do have a few more questions still to go, but just to be specific with those questions, that might be more helpful offline. Another question here was, can I run any of the tests in my own lab before the event?
Yeah, good question. The answer there is yes. It sounds like some people have already started doing that. Both the Teledyne LaCroix tests and the IOL INTERACT PC Edition tests. So you can obtain that software through UNH-IOL. We can help you get it set up in your own lab and have a good idea of exactly how your device is going to perform against those tests. So the answer is yes.
Okay, great. And can I share the reports I get from the Plugfest event?
Yes, in fact, you can, and that's really, those reports are designed to be shared to help you prove what sort of systems a device has proven to be interoperable with. And that's why we have a wide variety of systems set up at UNH-IOL. And we chose those systems purposefully, systems that we thought would be most likely to be used out in the field. So yes, we'd like people to share those interop reports, and then same with the conformance reports. If you have a report that demonstrates that your product has met the requirements for the conformance requirements for the NVMe Integrators list, by all means, you can share those with your customers and partners.
Okay, great. Next question, do we need to use Ubuntu desktop or server version of 12.04?
Yeah, we've had success with a desktop, and that's what we've been using in our lab. I don't think we've done too much testing with server. It might work with server, but I don't think we've actually used it with server, just desktop.
Okay, and can I test with a proprietary driver?
Yeah, so we're aware of the fact that there's the reference and native drivers out there that I referred to earlier, the OFA reference driver for Windows, Microsoft's own native driver that's included in Windows 8.1 and Server 2012 R2. Obviously, a lot of those Linux distributions are built off of the Linux reference driver. But then many companies have been creating their own proprietary driver that may unlock certain features, may do other things that perhaps help the performance of the device. And it's fine to test with those, to provide those at the event and do interoperability testing with those. But those are only part of the equation, if you will, for qualifying a device for the Integrators list. For example, if a device came to the event and it was only tested with proprietary drivers, it would not meet the requirements for having a product or having that product listed on the Integrators list. If it was tested with the Linux reference driver, the native Microsoft driver, the OFA reference driver, and then also some proprietary drivers, then it would meet the requirements for the Integrators list. So yes, you can test with proprietary drivers, but not exclusively. You would have to demonstrate interoperability with the reference and native drivers as well.
What kind of a connector should my device have?
So we're expecting that at this event, there's going to be most devices are going to have a typical PCIe chem card connector. And that's what we're prepared to test both on the conformance side and on the interoperability side. If you have a different connector, for example, if you have an SFF8639 connector, if you have an M.2 connector, we would really encourage you to bring some kind of adapter that's going to allow you to connect that to a chem slot on a PC.
Okay, thanks for answering all of those questions, Dave. That is all we've received for questions so far. We just wanted to mention that we are encouraging everyone to sign up now if you're interested in the Plugfest. It is only a month away. We will be sending out a link to this recorded webinar, and if you have questions regarding the consortium or membership pricing, you can contact Carrie Munson at the IOL. I'll give you her email address in just a moment, or you can follow through the links that are in the presentation that Dave has provided. We do have another question, though, that just popped up. We have been using the NVMe test tool to validate our NVMe device, and we feel that there might be issues with some of the test cases. Can we send an email to someone here at the UNH with such queries about NVMe?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing I did fail to mention in the presentation today. UNH-IOL serves as the admin for NVMe on the GitHub site. So you could send those directly to UNH-IOL. That would be fine. We'll certainly pay attention to those kind of bugs. We're very interested in finding bugs in NVMe. But it might be easier to put those in via the GitHub website. So you can sign up for the TNVMe mailing list via the GitHub website. That would be another way of making sure that those bugs are put in and logged properly. So either one is necessary, either via the GitHub site and the TNVMe project, or you can contact UNH-IOL directly.
Okay, we haven't received any other questions, David, if you want to wrap up with any other comments at this time.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to, of course, thank everybody for their time today. We're looking forward to having this Plugfest, hoping to make it a success, and we hope that this webinar has helped people to properly prepare for the event. For those folks that had questions that are perhaps more technical in nature, feel free to contact us directly. We're very interested in supporting the work that people are doing in their own labs. So if we need to do some one-on-one support, we're more than happy to do that if that's going to lead to a more successful Plugfest and a better experience for everybody. So certainly feel free to contact us directly about that. But again, thank you all for your time, and I look forward to hopefully meeting some of you at our event next month.
Thank you so much.